Hi, everybody. Isn't it great? It's a beautiful space. Pretty good dinner. Thank you, Cynthia. So I cannot believe that Dr. Schneider said that trade was, did you use the word dry? I just want to get that out there. Many of us have a passion for this subject, and usually we're not the most popular people at the cocktail party. That has changed, hasn't it? Now everybody, our dance cards are full. Everybody wants to talk about it. What we're finding, though, is that a lot of the issues that we're talking about today have been boiling beneath the surface for a long time. So I'm sure Rob's going to talk about inequality. We're going to talk about trade, and we're going to talk about trade policy and what is right for our country. I am going to start by talking specifically about China, and we know that many of the issues and conflict that we have with China have been going on for years. So even though trade has not made it up to that top-level headline in the past, many of the things that we talk about have been very much on the minds of Americans and people all over the world for many, many years. One of the interesting things when I am a professor from Syracuse University. I spent my career as a professor and very happy training undergrad, graduate, doctoral students. Since I've been at Peterson, of course, I've done so much more media, especially given what's happening today. One of the interesting things is that we get requests from all over the globe. So we know people all over the world are interested in, A, what is the U.S. doing, which reflects our historic and longstanding role as a leader in international trade and the rules by which it occurs. And secondly, of course, because of what's happening today, which is really unprecedented in terms of the types of trade policy that the United States is pursuing. So let me just make a statement that I had prepared for something else, but I thought it might be good. We'll get into a little bit more, might be a little bit more fun to have a little spark going. So I'm going to talk particularly about China. We're going to talk later, of course, about NAFTA or Europe. Today there was a statement issued by President Abe, President Trump, about future of U.S.-Japanese relations, and hidden in that, of course, was protectionism. So many of things that look like trade liberalization are actually quite protectionist. In this particular case, it's about voluntary export restraints on automobile trade. So we're kind of back to the future, because long, long ago, when I was young, when I was your age, actually my first degree was in public policy. And when I came out from school, I had a lot of, guess what, college loans. So thankfully for your fellowships, I hope it reduces that quite a bit, because that's a burden that so many of us have had to pay off, I guess. And we had the first round of voluntary auto restraints, which were with Japan. And as my first car, I wanted a Toyota, an entry-level Toyota, and of course I found that it was very expensive. And at that point, I was actually doing city and regional planning. I was not a trade person. And it occurred to me quite quickly that I was not liking this at all. And I remember running into someone who said, well, don't you like it because maybe there'll be, some more jobs for automakers. And I have no problem with auto makers or people who work in auto plants or anybody else, but I thought, no, actually, I do have a problem because I have no money. I'm getting my first job and I need a car to get there. So that was kind of my first introduction. And it struck me today when I saw that I really thought that this was in the past. And the reason why I thought it was in the past is, of course, that with the WTO and the agreements that were signed to create the WTO, countries agreed not to use voluntary export restraints, not to force each other to engage in this type of trade barrier. And of course, we're seeing it again, and we're seeing it from the leader, which is the United States. So we're going to see more, probably. Turning to China, you may know that there was an investigation into Chinese practices, technology transfer practices, and intellectual property protection practices that reported out this summer. And as a result, President Trump placed 25% tariffs on almost 50 billion of American imports from China. Earlier this week, another 10% tariffs were levied on another 200 billion of imports from China. and that rate will go up to 25% tariffs by next year. President Trump has already repeatedly threatened to go for the whole enchilada, which will be the remainder of this. So another, I think, 250, I was going to say 260. It depends, because they didn't actually do it on everything they said they did, but 260. So we'll have, the entire relationship will be covered with tariffs, probably up to 25% on our part. In response to Chinese retaliation for these tariffs, which now cover more than 2/3 of U.S. exports to go up to 100%, President Trump has promised to tax the remainder, and we're likely to see those by the spring of next year. So these actions have occurred in a general ratcheting up of trade tensions and American trade barriers. With the latest round of tariffs on China, President Trump has imposed new trade restrictions on 12% of U.S. imports during 2018 alone. That's not just the tariffs on imports from China. It also includes imports of steel and aluminum, as well as some others. The combined trading partner retaliation, so countries reacting to our tariffs, will cover about 8% of U.S. exports. And I'm sure many of you have heard in the news about soybeans and pork and fruits and nuts and whiskey, Harley-Davidson. So just different things that have been targeted by our trading partners who are upset with the tariffs that have been placed on their exports to us. Now, it's my view that these taxes, A, make manufacturers operating in the United States and employing U.S. workers less competitive and less able to compete abroad, as well as at home. That B, they disproportionately harm U.S. exporters, especially farmers and ranchers, and C, they punish American consumers, especially those with low incomes. The new tariffs inflict damage on the United States while failing to create a means while failing to provide a means to create good-paying jobs in America, or to change practices overseas that we don't like. In this case, with China, particularly their approaches to technology transfer. Why did tariffs on China make U.S.-based manufacturing less competitive? For the average person, there seems to be a simple logic. If you tax them, we can keep those jobs home. It seems logical. In fact, of course, that goes against a lot of economic theory about how we make our country most productive and therefore have higher incomes. So the tariffs in this particular case, the ones that are levied on China, raise the cost particularly of inputs for U.S. manufacturers. So far, about 75% of the goods that have been taxed are either intermediate inputs that are used by our producers, or they're capital goods that are also used by producers. You may have read in the paper that the Trump administration has held back tariffs on consumer goods because they don't want people to feel the impact too soon, or they want it to be indirect, and therefore people won't know what's happened. In fact, Secretary Ross just last week said basically that we wouldn't be smart enough to figure it out. Now, it turns out that it's not only that these are going to make us uncompetitive, but that we're not even actually taxing goods that are produced mainly by Chinese domestic companies, or, which seems to be one of the key sources of conflict, state-owned enterprises. A very large share of this imports is trade between related parties, which are American-based manufacturers trading with their affiliates abroad, or purchases from non-Chinese firms operating, non-mainland Chinese firms operating in China. So for example, electronics, some electronics, not your earbuds or Apple Watches, so your Christmas gifts on those are safe, but a lot of electronics have already been covered, and a good example which you will all be familiar with would be Foxconn, which is actually a Taiwanese firm. And those exports to the United States are multinational to multinational. And those are, especially in the electronics, machinery, capital goods, those are largely dominate a lot of the trade that we see between the U.S. and China. It's not Chinese big state-owned enterprises in general exporting directly to the United States. So raising the cost of these components and machines hinders American firms' abilities to be cost competitive against foreign-made firms sold here in the United States. And they come on top of what it's already been, large increases in the prices of steel and aluminum. American exporters are doubly hurt by the conflict. On the one hand, their production costs are higher thanks to higher tariffs on imported inputs. And on the other hand, they face higher tariffs when they try to sell into overseas markets. Now, clearly, if you're big enough, there's an answer to this problem. Just don't make it in America unless you're going to sell it in America. That's what would lead to what I call Fortress America. Make it here if you're going to sell it here. We'll have a protected market with less variety, higher prices, and less competition. And move your activities offshore if you want to export. For producers who can't move, like farmers, they're really losing out. Soybeans, fruit, nut growers, pork farmers, ranchers, they're all facing higher barriers to foreign sales. They're losing access to customers in foreign countries who may never return once they change suppliers. Lastly, we can turn to the American consumer. While the last two waves of China targeted American manufacturers, the U.S. consumer is going to feel it, probably this spring, because the rest of the stuff will be things like clothing and footwear and toys and sporting goods. And retailers will be forced to raise prices. And they'll let customers know why they're raising prices, because, Walmart doesn't want to be the bad guy. That's good. American people should know. If they approve of this, that's fine. They have the ballot box. I think the saddest part is that this is not going to bring back good jobs. In fact, we know that it will destroy some good jobs, as we've already heard firms tell us. Today, Ford Motor Company, which has been a very successful company of late, all the auto sector got hit hard during the Great Recession, announced that the steel and aluminum tariffs are going to cost them, I think, another $1 billion. It was some unbelievable sum. So are we going to get the jobs back? Because a lot of people say, well, we're going to pay higher prices, but it'll be good if we get some jobs back, notwithstanding the fact that we're at a record, very low, I won't say record, very low unemployment, right? Where are the jobs going to come from? Well, you might say, well, but those are MIC jobs. We want better jobs. Of course we want better jobs. Is this the way we're going to get better jobs? The answer is clearly no. You don't get better jobs by making producers have higher costs and have less ability to sell abroad. Let's think about what we import from China. When we look at the actual unit values, how much, what is it even? Take a computer chip. Take one that's made in America, take one that's the stuff we import from China. What's the difference? The US ones are very expensive, they're very advanced. The Chinese ones are very inexpensive. They're the chip you find in your dancing Elmo. Now that's changing. Obviously China is advancing. Every developing country wants to advance. They want to move up into higher value-added goods so that their people can earn higher incomes. But it's not true that we're going to be starting making chips for dancing Elmo. That's going to go to Malaysia or Indonesia or other places way before it comes back here. So in short, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, we're hurting our workers, we're hurting our producers, and we're not going to get the change that we want to see in China. That's going to require us to do the hard work of diplomacy, targeting specific policies that we want changed, monitoring compliance with those changes, and just dogging it year after year after year. You can't just go out and bully someone and tell them you want it done. You have to stick with them to change behavior. It's like, I say, it's like my kids. I can just yell, stop it! And they don't know what it is they're doing that's wrong. We need to say, stop hitting your sister. If I see you hit your sister again, you're going to your room, right? And then follow up, right? I can't go into the kitchen. I have to follow up. So we do know how to do it. It's the hard work of diplomacy. It's not getting up and throwing a bunch of taxes on American consumers and firms. Thank you.